In this presentation for the Carter-Jenkins Center in Tampa, Florida, I'll present a brief description of the various stress disorders that people often suffer following major disasters and describe some early intervention strategies for working with traumatized adults and children in the immediate aftermath of such disasters. What I have to say today was written following the December 1999 floods that devastated much of Venezuela, killed 15,000 people, and left 500,000 homeless and psychologically traumatized. The content of the article was originally presented in lecture format for professionals and non-professionals who went out to work with the survivors in the emergency shelters set up all across the country. By non-professionals, I'm referring here to professionals outside the mental health professions, businessmen, housewives, other adults, and even high school students. After the initial oral presentation, it was written in English, translated into Spanish, distributed to the workers in the shelters in Caracas, and sent out on the internet to mental health professionals all across the country. Though it was written for professionals and non-professional counselors working with survivors of the Venezuelan floods, it'll hopefully be useful to others in the future working with survivors of a wide range of major disasters, whether they be natural disasters, devastating accidents, or other tragedies caused by people. Before getting into the content, I want to advise those that are watching this presentation on the Carter-Jenkins Center website that anyone interested in using the material in this presentation or the written versions of it in English or Spanish, which are located on the Carter-Jenkins Center website, want to use this to train crisis counselors should feel free to distribute it at no cost to anyone they want without feeling the need to get permission from me or the various previous publishers. Furthermore, anyone that wants to translate it into other languages should feel free to do so without having to get my permission. When tragedy strikes, people need to be able to act fast. And now to my formal presentation. Though my predominant theoretical orientation is psychoanalytic, I will not be speaking specifically about psychoanalytic theory or technique. This will mostly be a presentation of simply what to do when disaster strikes. The following information has been found to be useful by Freudians, Lacanians, Jungians, and even cognitive behavioral therapists, as well as the non-professionals that I mentioned before. But to my psychoanalytic colleagues, I want to remind you that the history of psychoanalysts rising to the occasion to meet social needs is a long and illustrious one. Sandor Ferenczi, Karl Abraham, Ernst Simmel, and Ernest Jones, working on both sides of the First World War, wrote the first monograph on psychoanalysis and the war neuroses, in which they dealt not with the physical trauma of the soldiers, but with their psychological traumas. After the war, Siegfried Bernfeld and Willy Hoffer set up the Kinderheim Baumgarten, a home for traumatized Jewish war orphans. Though it did not last long, it served as the inspiration for Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham's war nurseries for what they called bombed-out children during the Second World War. Since then, psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic insights have been useful in treating the stress disorders formerly referred to as war neuroses in every war since the First World War, and more recently in response to the September 11th attack on the Twin Towers in New York, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and a massive fire in Paraguay, to mention only a few. The psychoanalyst and psychotherapist do not do analysis or any kind of in-depth psychotherapy after a major disaster, in the immediate aftermath of a major disaster. They do counseling. But they do so with a special sensitivity and one that allows them to bring their knowledge in the service of their community. But enough of that. The rest of this lecture is intended to be useful to all mental health professionals and non-professionals as well, who find themselves caught up in the aftermath of a major disaster. Because I have a wide audience that I am speaking to, when I use the term counselor, I'll be referring to anyone that is helping people manage their psychological crisis after a disaster. But for my professional colleagues, I will also present some distinctions between crisis intervention and after major disasters and seeing patients in your professional psychotherapy offices. What is a psychological crisis? A psychological crisis comes about when a traumatic event overloads a person's capacity to cope in his or her usual fashion. Psychological crises cannot reliably be predicted based on the events that precede them. An event that precipitates a psychological crisis for one person is not necessarily going to precipitate a psychological crisis for another person. Nonetheless, some events commonly precipitate psychological crisis reactions. These include physical assaults, torture, rape, automobile accidents, intense personal losses, and natural catastrophes such as earthquake, fire, and flood. Events like these will often induce a psychiatric disorder that we call an acute stress disorder. The acute stress disorder is characterized by feelings of intense fear, helplessness, and horror. There may also be an emotional numbing, a lack of emotional responsiveness, a feeling of detachment, reduced awareness of surroundings, and a sense of unreality or amnesia. People suffering an acute stress disorder may feel anxious, excitable, agitated, distressed, despairing, irritable, or hopeless. They may re-experience the event in recurring dreams, flashbacks, or persistent memories of the trauma. The person may avoid people, places, and objects that may reawaken memories of the traumatic event. They may have difficulty concentrating and may have difficulty functioning in their usual way at home and at work. They may also suffer guilt or guilt for providing not enough help for others. Some people may become aggressive or self-destructive, disregard self-care, become confused, or behave in a bizarre fashion. When dealt with quickly, the symptoms of acute stress disorder will typically diminish or disappear entirely within 30 days. In some cases, particularly when untreated, acute stress disorder may persist. If its duration is from 1 to 3 months, we call it an acute post-traumatic stress disorder. When the symptoms last more than 3 months, we call it a chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. It is not uncommon for untreated post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms to persist for many years and become serious constraints on a person's life. It is also important to remember that when a person struggles with a severe stress reaction, it is likely that the family or any other people around the person directly affected will be affected secondarily by the symptoms of the person's post-traumatic stress disorder. Working with acute and post-traumatic stress disordered persons. Counselors working with acute and post-traumatic stress disordered persons may assist them in the management of the post-traumatic event tasks. These include simple things like informing others, going to get some food, helping them get their clothes washed, making phone calls, rescheduling the person's daily routine, very mundane things that are absolutely essential in helping the person cope in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic experience. They'll also be involved in providing a safe place to talk about either the event, the person's symptoms, or whatever else is foremost on the person's mind. Though it is sometimes initially painful to talk about the traumatic event, people often report a sense of relief and a reduction of symptoms after they have been able to talk about what happened. They can see the situation more clearly after putting the pieces of the problem out on the table and looking at them together with a counselor. While adults may talk with a counselor, A child suffering an acute stress reaction is likely to talk about it in the child's nonverbal language of play, as well as in the verbal spoken metaphors of the stories they tell from their imagination. So with children, we're more likely to conduct a play therapy session, but more about this later. In many circumstances, as mentioned above, the sudden behavior change of the traumatized person affects the whole family. When this happens, it is often helpful for the whole family to meet with a counselor who can help them address the difficult issues and improve communication between family members. A traumatic event is one in which a person's coping mechanisms are overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation. In treating acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, we want to recover the event, break it down into smaller pieces, understand it, master it, digest it, and make it all the more intelligible. There are, however, some circumstances in which a person is uninterested or unable to speak of the specific traumatic event. In these circumstances, the person is encouraged to speak about whatever is uppermost in his or her mind, and their symptoms sometimes diminish nonetheless. Counselors working with survivors of natural disasters. In natural disasters such as earthquakes, catastrophic fires, and floods, it is important for counselors to remember that everyone is affected by the crisis, including the counselors themselves. This is something that only dawns on people usually a little bit after they have gotten into the crisis, when they realize that the flood or the fire or the earthquake has shaken them up as well. And suddenly they move from, if they move quickly into being the counselor and don't recognize just how traumatized they've been by it, they're going to be missing something. So we need to be able to take into consideration our own reactions, and instead of just simply looking after those that need our help, we need to also pay attention to ourselves and also whatever other fellow counselors we're working with. As such, there are several useful principles to keep in mind. First, counselors need to take care of themselves and each other physically and emotionally. It is easy for counselors to become overwhelmed and emotionally drained by this kind of work. They need to take breaks, eat properly, and rest when they become tired. This sounds so absolutely basic. One might even ask, why even mention it? The reason to mention it is because in an emergency, people forget this. That's exactly what happens. People lose their priorities and they forget just these kinds of things. They need to take breaks, eat properly, rest when they become tired. A traumatized and overwhelmed counselor is not able to help the people that need him or her. Experienced psychologists and psychiatrists who have never worked in crisis before are often quite surprised to discover how exhausted they feel after doing crisis counseling for only 2 or 3 hours. 2, counselors need to remember to think clearly. It is easy to lose perspective and become confused in a crisis. Counselors should try to slow down, make a checklist of priorities to address with each case, and discuss their clinical decisions with their colleagues. You're going to notice that I'm going to be introducing some strategies that some people might think of as being obsessive-compulsive. It's going to be making lists. It's going to be writing things down. Why? Because in this kind of an emergency, these kinds of strategies help us get organized and focused on the goals we need to be able to meet to help the traumatized person. 3, counselors need to set priorities. In a crisis, people often lose their ability to evaluate what is important from what is not. With each case, it'll be helpful for a counselor to have a checklist for guiding him or her through the work. It might include information such as name of the affected person, age, address, family members, physical illness or injury, time of the last meal, etc. By the way, When I was working at one of the shelters in Caracas, Venezuela, we had about 1,200 volunteers that were ready to work at this particular shelter. And of them, I think it was an extraordinary number of like 400 or 500 or 600 psychologists. And so people were coming in one after another to help out in the shelter, but there was no coordination. So one psychologist would see somebody, and then they would leave, and another one would see them, and another one, and there was no chart. And there was no way to track what it was we were doing to help this person and what tasks need to be followed up on and things like this. So we simply got some folders and made a form and created a half-page job description, and each volunteer came in, would be able to read that, look at what needed to happen, and be able to help the affected people in the appropriate way. Safety and medical concerns, sleep, food, and shelter must be either attended to or considered before any psychological treatment can begin. Many people are delirious, anxious, or depressed because of medical problems. Others are agitated due to lack of sleep. If a person hasn't eaten for a while, they may be depressed, agitated, or have difficulty thinking. It is dangerous to treat these kinds of problems as only psychological problems. I'm not minimizing psychological problems. I'm just saying the person that is agitated might be agitated because of the trauma. It might be a previous psychological problem, and it might be the fact that they haven't eaten for 2 days. We need to be able to pay attention to the person's physical and medical needs in addition to their psychological needs. Sometimes a traumatized person needs a meal, a rest, some first aid, or some medication more urgently than anything else. It should be noted that people cannot overcome their fear until the real danger has been removed. We're not going to be doing crisis counseling with someone who is running from a fire or trying to escape a burning building or something like this. First things first. Again, why does one need to say something so obvious? Why? Because we often lose our priorities in these kinds of circumstances and do, in fact, act in sometimes bizarre ways, and we need to be conscious of, okay, when are we going to do what? 4, counselors need to work collaboratively and seek supervision from one another. Crisis work is best performed in a site where intense interdisciplinary interaction between colleagues is possible. Such an environment gives counselors the opportunity for mutual supervision and consultation with medical doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and others involved. It is easy for counselors to become overwhelmed with the intensity of the problems and find their thinking clouded. Consultation becomes essential for conscientious crisis intervention. Those that are more accustomed to working in a private practice find it sometimes difficult to be able to essentially share a case or work with other people with regard to one person. And yet in crisis intervention, it is actually a state-of-the-art intervention to be able to work in collaboration with others, especially around some of these very difficult situations that are likely to emerge. 5, working with people in crisis is not the same as seeing patients in a private practice or clinic setting. Your crisis intervention office may be a large room with many other people in it doing all sorts of different things. Or it may not be in a building at all. Confidentiality may be seriously compromised by the nature of the emergency and the need for support from others. We still want to maintain as much confidentiality as possible, but in a crisis, you may end up having to explain to a police officer or anybody, any responsible person involved, that you have someone that is has some very, very special psychological needs. And we want to maintain as much confidentiality as possible, but we also want to be aware that sometimes that confidentiality gets compromised by the nature of the crisis, the nature of the emergency, and the resources that are available. You know, we had a very nice team assembled in Caracas who was all set and ready to go out and help the people out of the coast, but we couldn't get them there. There were a whole bunch of people that were out at the coast that were helping, and because they couldn't be relieved, they ended up working for 72 hours straight. You encounter these kinds of problems in an emergency, and you have to be ready for them. Office hours in a crisis have nothing to do with the clock. Counselors meet with people when they're in need, and sessions last as long as the needs and resources allow them to last. Counselors working in a crisis need to be light on their feet. They need to leave the private practice model behind, leave the clinic model behind. They need to look at the situation for what it is and be as creative and innovative as they can be. They need to improvise with space, time, materials, and resources. They need to collaborate closely with others. They need to assess their tasks and choose goals appropriate to the circumstances and the situation. They need to be forgiving of others and themselves when they lose their composure. If at all possible, they need to maintain their sense of humor. As I mentioned, there were a lot of psychologists that were working in this particular shelter in Caracas. And as I said, it included psychologists from all sorts of different theoretical orientations. One Jungian analyst told me that she saw a group of about 5 or 6 adolescents, and they had an expression of boredom that she recognized from that her son had the same expression whenever he was bored. And she knew if she didn't do something, he would get into some sort of mischief, and she believed that this group of 5 or 6 boys were just about to get into some sort of trouble. And so she did with them what she did with her own son. That was to give him a job. And there were some supplies that needed to be moved from the drop-off point and brought into the shelter. She gave these boys this job, and suddenly they had meaning. They had a role in the shelter. Their mental status improved. They had a role to fulfill. Mischief was avoided, and it was a very nice, elegant intervention that addressed a lot of needs all at once. Was it the analytic thing to do? Absolutely not. Was it the right thing to do? Absolutely yes. The crisis intervention setting is different from a clinic setting. The counselor may be in a school or a church, in a field, or under a tree. And just as the crisis intervention setting is different from a clinic, so too are the problems with which the crisis counselor deals. The problems include the kinds of symptoms described earlier in the section describing acute stress disorder. During the crisis, the goal of treatment is not characterological change or insight into the childhood origin of the person's problems. No, the goal of crisis intervention is to help the person to cope with the trauma. The goal is to help the person adjust to the new situation. The goal is to return the person to the previous level of functioning, if at all possible. These goals are met by inviting the person to talk about his or her experiences, get some perspective on the event, sort out the associated feelings, and problem solve about how to deal with his or her problems. Can one do analytic work with a patient after a trauma and be helpful? Absolutely. And that will be something that will follow. And then the analytic principles will become very, very useful. But in the immediate aftermath of the trauma, we want to be able to approach some of these problems in a little bit more of a direct and directive fashion. First contact. In the first contact, it'll be useful to get a little bit of information like the person's name, medical condition, social support system, etc. But the person in crisis should not be subjected to a long intake evaluation. The counselor should try to set the person at ease, clarify the task, and invite the person to talk. A good crisis counselor is a good listener, but the crisis counselor is often more active than a psychotherapist who sees patients on an ongoing basis. The crisis counselor clarifies, reassures, educates, offers advice about practical matters that the person needs to deal with, and refers them to appropriate agencies and programs. The counselor needs to be very mindful of the person's medical condition, seek medical consultations about any concerns that they may have, and make appropriate referrals for medication consultations whenever anxiety, depression, agitation, or sleeplessness are at levels that severely impair functioning or make the crisis intervention impossible. In the midst of a crisis, people lose perspective. They're flooded with thoughts and feelings. They have difficulty setting priorities, and as a result, they tend to get very concerned about things they can't deal with and tend to avoid or ignore the more immediate concerns of the moment that they can deal with. For this reason, it's often useful to help the affected person to organize his or her thoughts into two sets of goals: a set of short-term goals and a set of long-term goals. The short-term goals include things as basic as calming down, trying to come to terms with the intense fear reaction, talking about what has just happened, getting shelter for the night, having something to eat, etc. The long-term goals, on the other hand, include things like getting into long-term therapy, looking for a job, finding permanent housing, these sorts of things. The crisis counselor needs to be very active and directive in helping the person sort out these two types of goals, and then in attending in a very practical way to achieving the short-term goals and making a plan to attend to the longer-term goals. There was one man that was very, very upset following the flood in Venezuela. And what was he upset about? That he had lost many of his neighbors? That he had lost his house? No, he was upset that he had borrowed a library book. And the library book had disappeared along with the rest of his house, and I might add, along with the library. But he felt he had somehow to get that library book and return it to the library. Now, you can say, well, my goodness, this sounds like this is going to be good work for a long-term psychotherapy. What sort of displacement has taken place here? Yes, that's a good way to think about it, but we also need to be able to help this person reorganize. Okay, we're going to deal with that, but we're going to call that our long-term goal. Okay? Your short-term goal is we need to get something in your stomach because you haven't eaten for 24 hours. Oh, okay. And people do need that kind of very basic assistance in these kinds of circumstances. And these things get forgotten. At the end of the session, it is often very useful to actually write up a plan for the person to follow and send the person away with the plan in his or her hand. It is best to prepare the plan with the person's collaboration, to write the plan in legible penmanship. If it's not legible, it does not exist. And to number each of the points and to format it so that it is easy to read. It may say things like, 1, if I get upset, I'll talk to a counselor. 2, I will call my uncle to see if he can help me out during the next 2 weeks. 3, I will talk to my doctor about replacing my usual medication for asthma. 4, I'll put my name on a list for low-rent housing. These sorts of things. Telling the story. People develop the symptoms of an acute stress disorder because they've been exposed to a traumatic situation that overwhelmed their ability to cope with the situation in their usual way. Consequently, their symptoms serve to cover or hide the overwhelming and unmetabolized experiences. Crisis intervention is intended to 1. Help the person tell his or her story. 2. Get some distance on the event to help understand what happened. 3. Hang words on the experience. And 4. Return the person to his or her previous level of functioning. As the affected person tells the story of the traumatic experience he or she may cry, laugh, yell, whisper, fall silent for a while, recall another seemingly unrelated loss, or become preoccupied with some feature of the story that seems insignificant. The counselor should listen patiently and help the person to return to his or her story again and again. Some common characteristics in the stories of trauma. In the process of hanging words on the experience of trauma, we find several recurring clinical pictures. And this list is by no means inclusive, but these are 4 very common characteristics of these stories. We might find those who are overwhelmed by emotion and have difficulty speaking. When these people are overwhelmed with these emotions, counselors should help them calm down by taking them to a quiet place, offering a cup of water or something to eat, allowing them to emote for a while, and then trying to help them speak about what they are experiencing. Sitting with the person in silence or letting him or her cry for a while is very helpful, but eventually it will be important to help them try to speak about the unspeakable. For those who don't convey any emotion at all while telling a story of horror, we might see these people as being emotionally numb. For them, the counselor can point out that the usual feelings that many people have in such circumstances and wonder with the person what feelings might be hidden from view. But it is also important to remember that if a person is emotionally numb, it is to ward off the overwhelming affect. It is important that the counselor respect the person's defenses and gives him or her time to let the feelings about the experience come to the surface on their own. Crisis counselors have recognized for many years the way that some victims of trauma may appear to be doing very well in the first few days following the crisis and then completely fall apart a week or 2 later when they're in the safety of another context. So we don't want to rip away somebody's defenses and say, come on, you need to talk about it, and you need to talk about it now because I heard if you talk about it, you're going to feel better. If the person is holding back, we're going to want to try to engage them, but we don't want to rip away that kind of defense. We want to make them safe, and when the time comes, they'll say what they need to say. 3, those who feel guilty for surviving the disaster while others died or were hurt. Though it is irrational, it is also very common to encounter people feeling guilty for surviving a tragedy that others did not. The crisis counselor needs to monitor suicidal impulses in these persons and help them to mourn their losses by inviting them to talk about the people and things that they have lost. Over and over and over again, we're coming back to the same theme, and that is that the way to overcome an acute stress disorder is to have the opportunity to talk, to take inventory, to remember, to mourn what has been lost. It is sometimes useful to ask the person if his or her deceased loved one would have wanted the person to suffer or be happy with the rest of his or her life. This is an extraordinarily cognitive appeal to say, oh, how would this person that you lost feel about you being sad? It's a very cognitive appeal. But it sometimes has the effect of shifting the focus from the survivor guilt to the mourning. So it's not something like, a guilt trip, an additional guilt trip, but really is an opportunity to begin to think about the loved one that we've lost and the opportunity to mourn that loss, rather than the survivor guilt covers that mourning. And we want to be able to help the person get closer to that and accept what is gone is gone. Those who feel that they either caused the calamity in some way or feel they should have done something differently to save someone. For those who feel that they may have in some way caused the flood or earthquake, or feel they could have done something to save their family, it is important to help them recognize the power of the opponent they were up against. Acknowledge the fear and confusion of the moment, and again, help them to mourn their losses. After the person has told his or her story, it is often helpful to tell the story again and again and again and again. People don't generally need to be told to do this, but they can be invited to feel comfortable telling their story repeatedly without feeling that they are boring us with the same old story. Counselors can expect that with each telling of that story, the details of the story may be further elaborated and the pent-up affect further released. Ending the crisis counseling meeting. Crisis counseling is, by its nature, very brief. Many crisis interventions take place entirely in one session. It is important to conduct the session as a single session treatment. If the counselor sees the person again, that's fine, but it's helpful to regard each session as an intervention unto itself. The crisis intervention should end with a concrete plan for the affected person to follow. The plan should be written and given to the person. If that person is a child, the plan should be given to the adult in charge or placed in a chart for the child's ongoing care. The counselor should make any and all referrals that might be necessary, and then the affected person and the counselor need to say their goodbyes. The counselor need not worry about being too neutral. It is okay in crisis counseling for the counselor to express sadness and anger about the tragedy the person met, to offer advice, and to wish the person good luck. Though physical contact is avoided in psychotherapy, hugs are not uncommon in the midst of catastrophic events. A reassuring touch or a hug can sometimes make all the difference in the world in the midst of a tragedy. While counselors need not shy away from touching a person affected by trauma, it is important to remember that the traumatized person is feeling something like an exposed nerve, and physical affection can sometimes be confusing. If there is a hug to be given, it needs to be satisfying the needs of the traumatized person, not the counselor. Counselors need to get these sorts of needs met from other counselors. Most of what I have said applies to children as well. The big difference, however, is that when children tell their story, they will tend to speak more in the language of play and in the metaphors of their imagination. As such, it'll be helpful to meet children who have suffered traumatic experiences with a pocket full of crayons and a pad of paper or a pile of toys and puppets. With the paper and crayons, children can draw a picture and tell a story that will reflect their concerns in metaphor. The invitation is for them to draw whatever they want and tell a story about it. To help the counselor understand the metaphor, it is useful to invite the child to talk about the picture. The counselor should not ask, "What is it?" but rather, "What can you tell me about this? What happened before this scene that we see here in the picture? What is going to happen next?" It is often useful to write the story down as the child dictates it to the counselor. Afterward, the counselor can read the story back to the child, and the story can be elaborated. In this way, the counselor and the child have the opportunity of entering into a dialogue about the monster or the war or the big animal or whatever other metaphor might be used to speak of their concerns about their traumatic experience. Sometimes children will draw images, concretely of the flood, of the fire, things like this. We should feel free to talk with them about their experience of those things as well. Drawing a picture and telling a story is also a useful technique when children experience flashbacks of the trauma or are awakened by nightmares of the trauma. When they can draw their dream and tell a story about it, they can often get some distance on it and manage it a little better as well. When children wake up at night, for example, frightened from a terrible nightmare, it does no good to deny the existence of the monster that they just saw. Instead, we want to ask them, show me what you just saw by describing it, acting it out, drawing a picture of it, or telling a story about it. Often, no interpretation is necessary of the material. No interpretation of this material is necessary. The counselor should just let the child express themselves and elaborate their stories while the counselor remains curious and empathizes with the affect, the feeling. If children have some difficulty getting started, the counselor can invite the child to draw a picture of the traumatic event, the house before and after the flood, the trees before and after the fire, the building during the earthquake, etc. Toys and puppets provide the same opportunity to express the child's deepest concerns in the metaphors of play. Connections, disconnections, and reconnections. We all know ourselves and find pleasure in our world through the connections we have to the people, places, and things in our lives. When those connections are cut due to fire or flood or earthquake, children and adults become frightened not only by the event they just suffered, but also by the disconnection from everything that once was their world. In such circumstances, it is important to try to reconnect the world by hanging on to whatever has survived, including objects and memories. When working with children, it is often useful to invite them to draw a picture and tell a story while the counselor takes dictation. Afterward, the child can draw pictures of his or her home before and after the disaster, draw pictures of the people he or she lost, draw pictures of how he or she used to feel, and draw pictures of what the feelings are now. The stories they dictate can be read back to them, and they can add additional stories and pictures in time. These pictures and stories can all be stapled together into a book, which may, for the rest of their lives, be the only thing remaining of all that they lost. Children need to feel at home where they are. If possible, define their sleeping space, put their possessions in a bag, and offer some sort of consistency. Reassure them of your efforts to do your best to help them, but don't offer promises you can't keep. Be honest. Help them feel at home in their temporary shelters. They will often enjoy having something like a toy that they can hang on to and use to maintain some sense of security during an otherwise chaotic time. If possible, it could be comforting to build some sort of schedule into the routine at the shelter. It might be useful to invite the children to sit together and have stories read to them. Children might also find some comfort in taking turns talking about their experiences of the trauma in a group context. But this should be monitored closely, as some children might be overwhelmed further by this sort of an activity. If possible, the children should have access to paper, crayons, pencils, toys, puppets, children's books, and safe places to play. The crisis counselors should expect upsets emerging seemingly out of thin air. The reason for this is that as children begin to feel safe, they will allow their memories and feelings to come to the surface, and suddenly they may just begin crying or even fighting. Other times, a word or an activity or a person will serve as a trigger, and suddenly the memories and feelings associated with the trauma will come rushing in. Children may have symptoms of insomnia, eating problems, aggressive behavior, withdrawal, bizarre behavior, etc. It is best to initially look at all of this as an expression of the trauma, but in fact, some of it might be pre-existing behavior simply re-emerging within the context of the emergency shelter. In this regard, it is also important to remember that adults, children affected by crises include people with a full range of diagnoses: depressives, obsessive-compulsives, psychotics, addicts, mentally retarded people, etc. And in a crisis, counselors will see all of them. People will often fall apart in a crisis and look much worse than they usually do, but after a suitable crisis intervention, they may be able to cope with the situation, adjust to the new reality, and return to their previous level of functioning. Finally, and this is worth repeating again, crisis counselors need to pace themselves in their work and avoid getting overwhelmed. If they do get overwhelmed, they'll need a crisis intervention themselves. This is not a joke. In fact, crisis counseling for emergency workers is becoming increasingly common. Though there is no shame in a crisis counselor needing a crisis intervention, whenever possible, we should try to avoid the possibility of a crisis counselor getting that overwhelmed. The crisis counselor needs to pace him or herself, eat properly, rest properly, consult with colleagues on cases, and debrief, that is, speak with a colleague or supervisor about particularly stressful or upsetting cases. The previous section on crisis intervention after major disasters can be found in written form on the Carter-Jenkins Center website in Spanish and in English. The next brief section is a description of a project which took place long after the flood that I've been referring to. 1.5 years after the devastating floods in Venezuela, the Universidad Central de Venezuela, the Venezuelan Central University, along with the Red Cross and a school in one of the heavily affected areas on the coast, began a project to help some of the children still traumatized by their experiences of the flood. In this project, 3 undergraduate university students received a basic training in psychotherapy with children. They evaluated 28 children and provided a brief treatment to 14 of them. Each child was evaluated with a battery of psychological tests to determine the presence of symptoms of psychological trauma. As part of the evaluation, each child was invited to draw a picture of the flood and tell a story about it. In the brief treatment of 10 sessions, the children were invited individually to draw a picture of whatever they wanted and tell a story about it in order to express their feelings, fantasies, fears, and thoughts. In the process, many children drew additional pictures of the flood and elaborated their experiences in vivid stories. Many people were involved in this project. Professor Martín Villalobos of Universidad Central de Venezuela was in charge of the central coordination of the project in relation to the university, the Red Cross, the children's school, and the 3 students that did the research and the clinical work. The students that did the work are, as you see here, Monica Fraca, Marjorie Gutierrez, and Sabrina Ramirez. And I should add that their thesis won them high honors. I provided the original idea and the clinical supervision. And finally, the children in the small town of El Rincon were the ones who remembered, drew their pictures, and told their stories of their experiences of the flood. After the project was complete, a selection of the stories and drawings were published in 3 national newspapers with the hope that the readers who were also survivors of the flood would read them, remember, and tell their own stories to their friends and family members, and in this way further elaborate whatever chronic post-traumatic stress disorder that might have remained. The following are a few of the stories the children told along with their drawings. These stories, originally in Spanish, have been translated into English. Bernard, 10 years old. I don't know how to draw very well. The house of my aunt. She lives in Maiquetía. We were there, and the house was split in 2 parts the day of the tragedy. I felt sad that the people were taken by the river, and I saw bodies without arms and without heads, and I saw a head all by itself. Many people drowned in their cars, and I felt sad. People were left helpless. My aunt was left with only one part of her house, and it could happen to me too. I felt like crying. I couldn't sleep. I see at night that the river is taking me. I don't want to die. This is the house when the avalanche of mud and rocks was coming from two sides with people, but they were dead people. Santiago, 10 years old. There are the rocks, and this is the tree trunk, the house. The man came out to see, and the lady, and this is another house, and the doors, and the other doors of the other houses, and this is the mountain, and this is the river. That's it. Sylvia, 11 years old. Here is the river with dead people, and here, describing her drawing, is my family sleeping. My daddy was going to the bathroom, and when he saw the river, he called my mommy. She got up, and she didn't want to call me because I suffer from the nerves. I was baptized when I was 2 years old, and I woke up with bruises, and my mommy said it was from the elves. The next day I went to my grandma's, and I saw the way the river was carrying rocks and trees and the family. My grandma was nervous and had a deep pain in her heart. My daddy went out to look for food, diapers, water to bathe with, and to make food. My aunt, she suffers from the nerves because of the tragedy. A lady carried a newborn baby in her arms, and the river took them away, and the mother and the baby died. Manuel, 12 years old. The river passed over the house. I was on the house there with another person. It took cars, street lamps, houses, people, bridges, dogs, trees, and some other things, and nothing more. Oh, and it took the market, and the people that were watching. There was looting. Everybody was scared and looting. I saw people buried. It took apartments and brought stones and sand. Victoria, 9 years old. This was when the rocks were coming down the river, and the people were coming down in the river, the children crying, even pregnant ladies, people in the river asking for help. This lightning is because my grandma's house, I sleep with my grandma and my cousins. The lightning struck right beside the bed where I was, and my cousin went to look for me, and she began crying with me, and then we all went to bed and covered ourselves from top to bottom because we were afraid. Marcos, 11 years old. This is the house, and the river comes, and it breaks in two, and a huge wave takes it away. And also the people that were getting into a car to leave, and the river came up, and we were running, and it took away the people and destroyed the houses. It opened holes, smashed the people, and the people hung onto the trees to save themselves. But the trees were also taken away, and the people shout as if they were crazy, saying, "The river, the river, the river is coming." And the people who could get away in their cars went to Barquisimeto, and there they were worried about their family, crying until the family arrived. They cried, they embraced, and they wished good things to each other. Some days later it passed, and they came back to La Guaira from Barquisimeto, and they bathed in the rivers, and they were all happy. These are stories that the children told 1.5 years after the tragedy. One of the things that the students were surprised about was to discover that they wanted to go in and work with these children who had been traumatized by the flood, and they discovered that in addition to being traumatized by the flood, many of these children were also in a state of ongoing trauma, in families of chaos, where there was drug addiction, there was domestic violence, and other sorts of things. We have to remember that in the midst of a crisis, everybody can take a hand in helping out. But we need to be able to bear in mind that we're going to have all of humanity there. They are going to be people from all walks of life with physical problems and psychological problems, and we're going to be seeing all of them. As I mentioned at the beginning, psychoanalysis has a long history of psychoanalysts rising to the occasion to help out people in their communities, and I believe that many of the other theoretical orientations have similar kinds of spirit, and of course we have this kind of spirit in a lot of other community organizations. I'm hopeful that this brief presentation, as basic as it is, will be useful to other people when tragedy strikes and people can come to the aid of their community. Thank you very much.